Welcome to Backroom Talk.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Backroom Talk. I'm Georgia, here with Carl, and we've got special guest Michael Bann here with us for the podcast today.
I just go deep down rabbit holes to help my clients out. So I've worked with, today we're going to talk about adaptive athletes. I've worked with tons of different types of adaptive athletes. If you think about an adaptive athlete, if I give you those thrusters, and we know that those thrusters are hard on you, well, that's a high intensity day then. So what do we do when we have high intensity days? We give low intensity days.
To listen to more Backroom Talk, be sure to subscribe. Learn to design personalized programs with the OPEX system of coaching by heading to opexfit.com.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Backroom Talk. I'm Georgia, here with Carl, and we've got special guest Michael Bann here with us for the podcast today.
Fourth time?
Fourth time, I think, yeah.
Maybe third or fourth?
It's definitely not the first.
Anyway, it's the most frequented guest on Backroom Talk. I don't think we've had anyone outside of you and I on here for three or four episodes.
No,
now.
I guess we like you. I think we think you're okay, Michael. If you've been on so many times.
I think Georgia's still very jet lagged from Australia. She's like a little loopy right now.
Yeah, guys, I can't promise that I'm going to have the sharpest commentary today, but I'm going to do my very best. I'm sure that most of our listeners know who you are by this point, Michael, but maybe for those people that don't, they've been living under a rock, they don't know who Michael Bann is. Could you just give us 60-second, 30-second pitch of who you are?
Yeah, I'm a strength and conditioning coach by trade, but I work entirely remotely now with Crafted, so Crafted Coaching, and been doing this about 15 years now, and finished up grad school in 2018, and I essentially, at that point in time, decided to become completely online, and just haven't really looked back. So I specialize in helping people who have tried everything yet haven't gotten results. So just throughout grad school, I kind of did a lot of research on movement screens and how to evaluate labs from a fitness lens. So I don't evaluate labs from like a ICD code or looking at disease, but I look at it from the lens of what should it be for optimal fitness versus disease or whatever. So I just go deep down rabbit holes to help my clients out. So I've worked with, today we're going to talk about adaptive athletes. I've worked with tons of different types of adaptive athletes. I've worked with military, law enforcement, special operations, special forces, SEALs. I've prepped a lot of people for selection. So just done it for a long time.
Yeah. Before we get into the conversation about adaptive athletes, one question for you.
Yeah.
So you're a remote coach. You're full in on that. What do you like and what don't you like about remote coaching compared to in-person coaching?
I love that I'm able to just kind of save on gas mileage by not having to drive anywhere.
Especially now.
Yeah, because
That's very important right now.
Yeah, I drive a Jeep, and it's like 8 miles a gallon, so that's nice. But facetiousness aside, I love the ability to help more people. When you work in person, which I did for years, even before I got to OPEX, I had done over 12,000 FMSs, in person, and I collected data on that for years. And I think there's a lot of magic in being in the trenches, but at some point you become limited in whom you can help because you have to put in physical hours with people on the floor. With remote coaching, it's a different type of craft, but I can help more people, and I have a little bit of freedom in terms of kind of setting my own hours. You have to be kind of aware of who you work with, because if everyone I work with is in Australia, then my hours are going to be super funky, right? So I have to make my hours available for a global level, but I get to do it from anywhere. I can literally plug my laptop into my Jeep, and I have satellite Wi-Fi with my Jeep, and I could work from the woods. So it's really cool. And then I can also do a lot of training for myself. So a lot of jiu-jitsu, a lot of stand-up stuff, and then a lot of stuff in the gym, obviously. So I have the freedom to coach and also train, and so there's good stuff. And then the downside to it is every once in a while I'll genuinely crave human interaction. And it's very rare. I'm very introverted. For those that don't know, I'm an Asperger, so I'm incredibly introverted, and social situations give me a lot of anxiety. But once in a while, I'll crave it, and it's just man, I could just go for some human chatter. So I'll usually just go to Whole Foods and talk to the cashier for 90 seconds, and I'm okay.
They're not this guy again.
All right, I'm good.
I'm out.
Yeah. No, actually, I made the cashier super awkward the other day because right when I showed up to the line, there's only 2 cashiers, and it is like everybody and their mother wanted to go like check out at the same time. So the line was like all the way back through the aisles of the grocery store, and the cashier's just like, does everybody just decide to go grocery shopping at once? And I was like, no, actually, we're on a Facebook group, and we like all chatted, and we decided to come to your specific line 5 minutes ago because we knew that you were bored. And she just starts like, and I was like, oh, I thought it was funny, but I guess not.
Stop dating yourself. You're talking about Facebook groups, man.
Oh, I'm an old man now.
No, but that was a good question. The what do you enjoy about being remote versus in person? Because there's a lot of coaches that think about, what do I want to do as a coach? Do I want to coach in person? Do I want to coach remotely? And, you can't really put this thought aside, but the thought of like you do need to work with people in person to be a really good remote coach. There needs to be some time spent, like you said, in the trenches before you make that transition and you're like, I need freedom and I'm going to do this thing completely online. But you have to really think about who you are as a coach and as a person as well, right? Because you just walk through like, I'm very introverted. Very seldomly I crave human interaction. And then you take someone that's on the other side of that spectrum that's just like, I'm extremely extroverted. And if I have to sit in my apartment and consult and design training programs for someone 5 days a week, I'd pull my hair out, right? Like remote coaching is probably not the way forward with them, even though there's a lot of positives to it, the freedom, satellite internet in your Jeep and programming in the woods and stuff like that, and being able to focus on yourself and all that. But I think people just need to look at like, who am I? What do I want? And what situation am I going to thrive in?
Yeah, I actually, if I was to liken it to anything, it's like jiu-jitsu. If you're 6'1" and 220, your game is different than if you're 5'2" and 110. And you have to go roll and spar with a lot of people to kind of figure out how to make your game work for you. And you get that by being in the trenches of coaching. It's the same thing. So knowing whom you work with, knowing the type of person, like, are you going to work with the person that constantly needs to be reminded and motivated? Do you enjoy that? Do you enjoy the life coaching side? Do you just want to like write like hellacious workouts and like smoke people? So by being in the trenches, you kind of get a feel for like who you are as a coach. And then also, you come across a lot of problems. Like the same problems that somebody has in person, you're going to have those problems online. Like, oh, my hip hurts when I squat now. Oh, my ankle is tight. Oh, this is bothering me. Hey, man, like my right hand is going numb after handstand push-ups. And if you haven't seen that tens of thousands of times in person, you won't be able to recognize it instantly online. And then you're just going to get bottlenecked and you're not going to be able to help people. So, I mean, before I even came to OPEX, I had done 12,000 FMSs. And then when I got to OPEX, I'd done at least another 10,000 or more movement screens. I've written 45,000 programs at this point. So when somebody comes to me, I can give you an example. The other day, Chris, is a jiu-jitsu client of mine in New York, and he's like, hey, man, I'm kind of experiencing this. I immediately, just having seen it thousands of times in the trenches, I was like, hey, this is what it is. This is what you need to do to fix it, blah, 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 blah. Comes back 2 hours later, hey, man, I went to the chiro, and Chiro actually said you were spot on. Like you already diagnosed and figured it out. Like not like a little diagnosed like medical thing, but like you figured out the problem and it's already feeling better because of the fixes you gave. If I hadn't spent thousands and thousands of hours doing that in person, I would have been like, go see a doctor. And so my ability to remote coach is successfully is because I spent so many years in the trenches. And that's something that I try to tell people. If you don't have 10,000 hours of in-person coaching, don't get into remote coaching. It'll bite you in the butt, and you will just find yourself bottlenecked because it's very rare you're going to get somebody in remote coaching that is perfectly moving, perfect, lifestyle, 21 years old, perfect hormones. Like it's just not common to get that. So if you haven't troubleshot a ton of problems in the real world, you're not going to have a good time as a remote coach. It's going to be very frustrating. And you have to have that ability to be like, okay, I've seen that 10,000 times. This is what that is, guaranteed. Boom, go. And then that also tells you what you can tell the client to go tell their physical therapist or their chiropractor or their physician. Hey, ask the physician to do this, blah, 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 blah. And it helps a lot. And so if you haven't had that kind of experience, it's just not smart to get into remote coaching because it'll bite you in the butt.
Well, guys, Michael does do remote coaching mentorship for coaches that are looking to grow in that realm. And as you can tell, he's not going to sugarcoat things. He's going to give you, no, he's going to give you the real advice that you need to make it or not as a remote coach. So I think it's really important to have mentors that are going to be real with you and not just tell you what you want to hear and sell you, this like secret sauce of how you can grow your remote coaching business, because there's certainly a lot of that out there. So good to have advice from someone like you for people that are getting into that realm.
Yeah, I think when I mentor people, I try to give them all of the mistakes I've made, right? Like my jiu-jitsu coach, he says it all the time. I wish somebody would have showed me this as a blue belt or a white belt or a purple belt, because now I'm a black belt and I finally am starting to realize some of these things, and I just want to save you the hassles. And that's kind of like what I want to do when I mentor people. Like, you're going to have to put in some serious work. It's hard work and it's frustrating. It requires a lot of discipline, but here are the mistakes I made, and this is how I avoid it now. Hopefully you can learn from that. And so I try to just avoid sugarcoating things for folks, because like you said, a lot of people are out there just selling that secret scroll sauce, and it doesn't get anyone anywhere, and it doesn't progress the industry forward.
For sure. Well, for those that are interested, we'll make sure there is a link in the description to go and check out remote coaching mentorship with you, Bann. Let's talk about the topic you wanted to discuss today. So Carl and I did a podcast maybe a month or two ago, a couple months ago, we called them the basic human guidelines. And we threw around some ideas of physical challenges that we think are good beacons for humans to strive for. And I will say, we gave the caveat in that conversation of, we all have different capabilities. Every individual in front of you is going to be capable of different things. This is just a broad throwing ideas at the wall type conversation of some things we think it's beneficial for people to be able to strive for if they have the physical capabilities to do so. Michael, talk to us about what you want to discuss relative to that conversation.
Yeah, so whenever we think about creating like ideas of what humans should be able to do, you have to be very macroscopic, right? And so most humans they have functional 2 legs, functional 2 arms, functional brains, they have normal nervous systems, etc. So when we create these guidelines, it's kind of like, so for a broad spectrum of people, they should be able to walk. They should be able to do maybe a push-up. They should be able to push themselves at least off the ground. But there are people out there that kind of get overlooked, and I have like a kind of a special place in my heart for that, because I used to work with adaptive athletes in person. I've worked with people that have had hemispherectomies, which is basically they had like half their brain removed, or like their brain was like cut in half because they had such terrible epilepsy that in order to like just not die from it, they had to have an operation on their brain, and then they lost like the majority of control on their left or right side of their body. And then because that control was lost, they had a lot of like spazzing out. So they had literally like one of my guys had his tendon cut in half so he could at least move his arm a little bit more, and he could like pick up like a pencil or something. But he was constantly in a position of like if he was in a sling. And so figuring out how to make that work, because he would run with a limp, he could barely use his left arm, and figuring out how to like make him get like bilateral exercises in, I think that was one of the things that really taught me a lot about human resiliency. And then I've worked with cerebral palsy athletes quite a bit, actually. I worked with one before I even got to OPEX. Great guy, could barely walk, and really liked the idea of like fighting in MMA. And he's never going to go into the UFC, right? But his ability to like use a walker was a limiting factor, and that's all he could do to walk. And so we worked for a good amount of time, and eventually he was able to back squat 135 to a medicine ball. Never needed a walker again, and was able to go and throw some punches and some kicks. And yeah, he definitely moved in a kind of an awkward manner, but I got caught up in that whole FMS world for years of like, if you don't have a 21 and if you have any asymmetries, you have a high risk for injury, and all of this. Greg Lehman called it kinesiophobia. We create this fear of movement because you're not passing a movement screen. And in grad school, I did a lot of research on movement screens, and it turns out that movement screens cannot predict pain, they cannot predict performance, they cannot predict injury. We see people all the time, quote unquote, move like trash or have horrible asymmetries. We see it in CrossFit. I mean, you got to give credit to where credit's due, and there's a lot of what we might call poor movers in CrossFit gyms, and they're getting stronger, faster, and better and healthier. And that's just in a group fitness model. Is it the most optimal way? Is it sustainable? Maybe not. But my mom is a great example of that. She does not move very well, but she can now deadlift 100 pounds for sets of 5. and she got stronger and more fit, even though she wasn't the perfect mover. But ultimately, human resiliency is massive. And I think as coaches, if we start thinking like this is exactly how a human should move, we completely forget about a population of people who maybe don't have a leg, maybe have cerebral palsy and don't have functioning bilateral sides, or maybe they've had brain injuries or something. And so we kind of forget how to work with those folks because they don't fit this paradigm or like this box of like, for the FMS, the 2-2-3-3-1-2, you know, I think they call it the 4x4 matrix in the SFMA world. And so by working with these folks, I kind of realized it's like, all right, if you want a back squat, 200 kilos, you probably have to move a certain way. And I kind of steal it from Greg Lehman, but he kind of says as the intensity of the goal goes up, the variability of movement has to narrow out. So if you want to back squat 1,000 pounds, there's very few ways to do that. But if you want to, back squat 10 pounds, there's many ways to do that. And I think coaches sometimes get lost in that. They're just like, I don't know what to do because this person can't do the back squat that I was taught to assess or the air squat I was taught to assess. And we get kind of caught up in perfection, and we forget that, perfect is the enemy of good enough. And I fell in love with working with these folks because it taught me how to have great exercise selection, how to change things on the fly. It taught me how to be like, okay, so that's good enough. I can let that go. And I can develop a way in the program design to give this client a win, like make them feel like they're getting better, to show them they're getting better, and without making them feel like they have what we might call a disability. Because there's a lot of folks I've worked with where I'm like, man, I could never do that. And I'm what we would call fully abled. And so I think as coaches, we just, as an industry, we don't do a good enough job, myself included, in showing that humans are fucking tough people, part of my language, but we're just resilient human beings. But of course, when you're talking macroscopically and you're talking, hey man.
Question for you really quick. What, just because we're going to probably throw around a few times like quality movement or good movement.
Yeah.
How would you define quality or good movement?
Ooh.
I know that's a big one, right? But how would you define quality or good movement?
Good would be, or quality would be, minimizing injury risk while maximizing performance and or nudging you towards where you want to be. Because not everybody wants to squat more, but they may feel like they just want to have a nicer feeling squat, right? And like that's totally okay. So I think minimizing injury risk, because you can never prevent injuries, and I want to be very clear on that. Like, I score a 21 on the FMS, and I was riddled with injuries in my 20s, and I realized that pain and injury are very different. You could have pain without any damage, and you can have damage without pain. So to me, when I say quality movement, I'm thinking in terms of, are we minimizing the injury risk as best as we can based on the goals, the needs, and the wants of a client? Because if someone comes to me and they say they want a back squat, 600 pounds, there is a massive injury risk potential with that.
Yep.
And we have to be okay with that because the goal of the client is that they want that and they need to do this. All right, like we got to be ready to accept that. And so quality just means, to me, lowering the injury risk to the lowest possible level based on what the client wants and needs.
Yeah, because I've thought about that a lot, like just going through a bunch of different assessment protocols over the past decade plus, and really thinking about, because I found myself in those situations where it's like you do learn, when you go through FMS, right? And like you take a, for example, an overfat client, right, through an FMS screen, and you're just like, man, I don't know what I can't do anything with this person, right? Like they are not capable, right? They're not capable of movement. And, just thinking about that over the years and just thinking about, all the other assessment protocols that have been proposed and that we've gone through. And it's like, is quality movement just the ability to create great efficiency within an individual's confines, right? So it's like, let's say, and I asked that question because I think it's going to extend to this conversation on what you're going to talk about, right? So let's say that you have someone with a physical or neurological disorder, right? I think that's who we're going to talk about mostly today. And because of that physical disorder, they can't squat past parallel, right? It's like, does that mean that they're not a good mover, right? It's like, can they efficiently squat within their own confines over and over and over while not getting injured, right? Or like, getting better, whatever the heck getting better means, whether that's like learning the squat pattern, or whether it's getting stronger, or whether it's being able to extend out reps over a longer period of time and or longer volumes. That's kind of where my head is, right? It's like, is that an acceptable definition of a quality mover? Someone that's able to find great efficiencies within whatever their confines are.
Yeah. While also, I think when you say it that way and you put it that way, we're saying the same thing, because when you do that, you're also minimizing injury risk. Because let's say you can't squat below parallel, but I give you box squats and you can maintain, relatively commonly accepted biomechanical, good movement.
Yeah.
I think that could be a perfect way of saying, hey, this person can't squat below parallel, but they can squat to a box with 100 kilos on their back. They're probably going to be able to live without a walker. So that's kind of where I start thinking in terms of the quality. It comes down to the human. And we got to stop trying to fit humans into boxes. And I get it. Like, if you're trying to sell a movement screen like the FMS for the last 20 something years, I get it. Like, you can't just be like, hey, there's so many nuances to this in a sales pitch. And you have to try and cover as many people as you can. Like, even the OPEX move assessment, it's designed to help the majority of people that coaches will actually experience. Like, most coaches are not going to go through, tons of people with CP or hemispherectomies or any other neurological disorders, or even like cognitive disorders like Down syndrome or whatever. You're just not going to experience that by and large all the time as a coach, unless that's like your niche. So I get the idea of movement screens trying to capture a large audience, and we have to do that, because we have to give coaches something to go on. But we also have to remember that humans are resilient, and if the goal is to become perfect at the FMS, great, let's train for it, right?
Yep. That's such a good point, though. I think it's what is the intention of doing a movement screen? Because I think for a lot of coaches, the intention of doing a movement screen is to ensure that if someone, or to identify if someone fails that thing, they need to go and program design and design this perfect program to then allow them to pass the next time they do it. Instead of, I'm going to take someone through a movement screen to understand what those confines are and what I have to work with, right? So instead of saying, okay, we're going to take you through a squat assessment, you failed the squat assessment, we can't squat because you didn't reach maximum ranges of motion, you're just saying in your head, okay, your confine in the squat pattern is there, right? It's the example of the person that can't squat below parallel. It's like, okay, I just have that in my brain. I don't really care if that's a pass or fail. I just know those are your capabilities right here, right now, and I'm just going to meet you right there. The goal isn't to get you under that. It might, well, depending on who the human is and what their goal is. If they want to compete in CrossFit, it's like, yeah, we need to reach a standard, right? If they're like, I just need to get on and off a toilet, man, right? It's like, okay, cool. Most toilets aren't at your like, that's not going to go, ass to calves, right? It's like, it's okay. We don't need to get that low. So I think, I guess I'm bringing it back to the intention of the movement screen, because you can do a bunch of different movement screens. And if you just think about it a different way, I think the coach walks away with not a better understanding, but like a more like, okay, I know I don't have to fix all that. I don't have to fix that scratch test. I don't have to fix that squat. I don't have to fix this, that, and the other. It's just like, I just understand where they're at right now. I'm going to program against that.
Yeah, I think the screen should just elicit truth. I mean, if you can't have your torso parallel to your shins, that's just food for thought. It's like, all right, cool, you can't do that. Maybe I don't put 400 pounds on your back while you try. And if your goal is to do that, then that's the goal. Let's work towards it. But I think the screen gives good ideas of what truth is, which allows us to set expectations for clients. It's like, hey, sorry, man, you're just not built to be a ass-to-grass squatter. Like, I don't know what to tell you, man. Just your bone structure is not like that. So maybe we don't do that very frequently. Or on the flip side, it reminds me of James years ago when he was much younger and competitive in CrossFit. He's not the best overhead squatter. Like, if anyone's ever seen him, he's got a rib flare. He's got some neural chain stuff going on. And ultimately, if he was to do a gazillion squat snatches or thrusters, that's hard on the body. And so the movement screen's great because it also shows you, like, hey, you're sports CrossFit and you're terrible at overhead squats. Too bad. You have to do them.
Yep.
But maybe we just don't program them frequently so it doesn't age you at a much more rapid rate, which then allows you to, hey, let's just work on power snatches a lot and then let's touch on some overhead squats and touch on some actual squat snatches. Or snatches. Sorry, the Olympic lifting crowd out there is going to yell at me for calling it a squat snatch.
That kind of hurts me a little bit too when I hear squat snatch.
I know it does.
I don't know why. I'm just like,
same. Well, I've been Olympic lifting coaching for like 10 years, and I hear somebody say, squat clean. I'm like, it's a clean or a power clean. Shut up. It's the same thing when you call it a rower. It's like it's an erg. Stop calling it a rower. The rower is the human on the erg doing the work. It's just one of those things I get under my skin.
but now it gets confusing, right? Because what do you call
What about the ski?
a ski? Yeah,
Skier.
skier.
Because it stands for
row
ergometer.
erg. Yeah.
It's a measurement of work.
So you're saying call it a row erg?
You can call it a rowing erg,
Yeah.
or in the rowing community, they would just call it an erg.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because nothing else exists to them. They're just like, this.
Yes.
The hell's that? Why are you doing that with your arms? It's stupid.
This is what's a skier for, man. The only people that need that are the Canadians up north. Like, if you're not Canadian, you don't need a skier.
Oh
I
man.
have a lot of Canadian friends, so I can say that. But yeah, I think when we think about the movement screen, it's just something to show coaches like, hey, listen, you got this guy who has a neurological deficit or this girl that has a neurological deficit. And ultimately, you just have to be conscious of that. And then you have to use good principles. And when it comes to understanding how to evaluate an adaptive person, like an adaptive athlete, you just have to make it repeatable. And that's what's so hard is like, well, they can't do this. What do I do? Well, how deep could they go on the squat? Just make them go that deep. Load it up, goblet squat. And then the other thing is sometimes load fixes everything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I see people have terrible squats, and then you give them like a kettlebell in front for a goblet squat, and boom, their squat mechanics are great. And so we have to also kind of consider that sometimes load changes the movement and makes it actually quote unquote better.
Yeah.
So when working with adaptive people, you know, you might not be able to have them on an assault bike for 10 minutes. They may not have function of that leg. And that was something that I learned with one of my guys that had the hemispherectomy. He couldn't bike. And when he ran, he had a massive limp. And so just understanding how to like, okay, how much volume can I give this person without hurting them? You start small and you build very incrementally. 5-minute jog, walk, 5-minute jog, walk, and then 7 minutes, 10 minutes. And it can be really slow sometimes. And you just have to find ways to give them things that show them, hey, you're better. Look at that. So that's kind of very broad spectrum, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, as you lay that out, though, Michael, it doesn't sound any different to how we describe working with any individual,
It shouldn't be.
adaptive or not.
Yeah, it shouldn't be because it's principles, right? Principles transcend paradigms. So the idea that we have to treat adaptive athletes like with special care, you have to treat everyone with special care. Don't give somebody something that'll hurt them, right? But an adaptive athlete is just another human, right? And if they only have one arm, like I worked with a guy years ago, he only had one arm. Of course, I'm not giving him barbell bench press, right? But he can do dumbbell bench press with one arm, all good. And I think it should not be different. And we get caught up in like, oh, but these are different people. Yeah, they're different for sure, but they're athletes. You got to train them like athletes and treat them like athletes and just give them what they can do.
It becomes challenging for coaches though if you throw, because we could say that easily, right? But throw 15 individuals with neurological disorders in front of a coach that has no experience working with those individuals, that becomes a little more complex. Where you're not just going to say like, oh, okay, I have these like principles in my head. I'm just going to utilize these. Like there's probably some deeper things that you need to consider. Mm-hmm. And I know that you've worked with some of those clients and I haven't, right? So I'm thinking about it from my standpoint. Like if you threw 15 humans with neurological disorders that I have no experience working with, I'm not gonna be overly comfortable working with those people. So what's some advice that you could give coaches that are listening that might, someone might, send someone a consultation request and they get on a call with them or get in front of them. And they're like, oh, I have this neurological disorder. Can you help me? And most coaches are just like, they're pretty alpha, right? Where it's just like, yeah, I think I can help anyone, right? I know what I'm doing. Or you have coaches that just don't want to turn away clients.
Yeah.
What advice would you give that coach that gets that individual in front of them? How do you move forward?
Yeah. One, you have to get into it to eventually not be uncomfortable with it. Mm-hmm. I think the whole thing of like, well, I'm just not comfortable with it. I haven't done a lot of it. Well, yeah, then why would you be comfortable with it? Like if you've never worked with a CrossFitter and you've never coached Olympic lifting and somebody wants to get better at Olympic lifting, you got to go coach it to get better at coaching it. So you have to get into the trenches. But a good principle that I like to live by is just patterns before parts. So look at the pattern, the air squat, right? We'll just do the air squat test or we'll do like a toe touch test or something. That is the whole pattern that we're looking at. But then look at the parts of that. So with an air squat, what are the patterns? Or it's knee flexion and hip flexion. So what are the parts? Ankle, knee, hip, lumbar spine, even thoracic spine. If we're talking about overhead squat, we're talking about, glenohumeral joints. So now you can just break that down a little bit. Like, do I have hip flexion? So if you think, oh man, I don't know if this person can squat because they don't have good hip flexion, put them on their back, supine, so they're laying upright, and then have them go into an air squat position just on their back. And can they bring their hips up and, quote unquote, if you were to like look at them, would they be below parallel? Like, can they get their thighs high enough to where their hips would be kind of below parallel? Awesome. So we know that they have good hip range of motion because that's a passive range of motion test. So they actually have the joint range of motion, and you don't have to put your hands on them. So if you're not licensed to put your hands on a client, then you're just watching them like, well, that's passive range of motion. You can do it. So I know that that's not a problem range of motion wise. Your joint has that capacity. Then look at the ankles, right? Can you drive your knee far enough forward on one leg only? So like a split squat, right? Except not vertical shin, but drive that knee forward. There's no number. Like, you don't have to be exactly 4 inches from the wall and then touch your knee to the wall or whatever. But can you roughly get maybe 45-ish degrees of dorsiflexion while just lunging forward? Yeah. Probably have enough dorsiflexion. So if you have that and you have the hip flexion, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a motor control problem. And so when I look at it from a principled perspective, I just look at the movement screen. Great, awesome. That's the squat. Okay. What do I think is the problem? Let's start closest to the spine and move further from the spine. So proximal, then distal. So patterns before parts. And then when you're assessing the parts, start proximal, then distal, which means I'm going to look at your core. I'm going to look at your hips. Then I'm going to look at your knees, and then I'm going to look at your ankles. And then for those that want to get even deeper with it, you could start looking at neurodynamics, the biomechanics of the nervous system. So you have a bunch of different nerves that run through the leg. You could have a tibial nerve issue that's causing a tight ankle, and it has everything to do with the low back. So it's not an ankle, it's a low back problem. That gets a little bit higher level, and you want to have some time in the trenches before you start evaluating that. But it's really simple if you just look at the parts after you see the pattern and then figure out, oh yeah, that's the problem. Okay, great. And then just attack that in the program design, right? Or if you think it's a core problem, they have great hips, they have great ankles, they can bend their knees, and it's not perfect, obviously, but they're able to do that. Well, then, you know what? Load them up a little bit, see if it improves. And if you look at them and then they're on their back and they can't bring their hips, up or whatever because of whatever issues they're dealing with, well, then okay, they actually have a legit hip issue. Like, they may have an actual, femoral acetabular impingement. They have FAI. It's painful. Don't load that, right? Like, let's do something else that prevents them from loading that. Or if it's, hey, hips are great, knees are great, back's great, everything's great, ankles are tight, great, box squats, squat to a med ball. But just look at the screen and say, hey, this is the movement screen, the overhead squat, and now I'm going to have them lay on their back, and I'm going to have them try the same exact pattern, just laying on the ground. And if everything looks good, most times it's a motor control problem. And you can train that with tempo. And as a general rule of thumb, I think people get caught up in like, well, am I going to hurt them? Tempo is a phenomenal way to prevent injuries because usually an injury occurs during the force absorption phase of movement. You don't see people blowing out their ACLs by standing up and their knees caving in. Valgus knees bilateral.
Except that one YouTube video, the dude backing out 1,000 pounds and his knees popped. I don't know if you guys have seen that.
Yes.
So, but that's actually that's eccentric, right? Because as he's backing out,
yeah,
it's not as he's standing up, but it's as he's trying to absorb the force as he's moving. That's eccentric.
Yeah, I think he was trying to figure out how the hell he was going to absorb that force. He took like 2 steps back, and it was like he was standing straight up, but he's like, I need to continue to stand straight up. And it was like his knees were doing the wobble thing, and you just saw his bone pop up.
Yeah.
Sorry to laugh at you, man. I hear you're okay.
Well, I think that's still an example of force absorption.
Yes, yeah.
Right? So most injuries.
Sorry, I don't mean to scare you guys that, Bann's telling you to do some tempo goblet squats with your clients. Their femur isn't going to pop out of the top of their leg there.
Yeah, no, I've never seen that happen with a goblet squat. I'm pretty safe with that one. But if you think about tempo, if I give you 5-0, 1-0 versus 5-0, X0, 1, you have to take 1 second on the way up. So it's got to be smooth, no sticking points, no grinding, 5 seconds down. So it's automatically going to limit load. And then because we're limiting load and we're slowing the movement down, a lot of injuries occur during the rapid phase of force absorption. So if I squat down real slow and I let my knee cave in real slow, the ACL is probably not going to pop. And if it does, there's probably something else already happening there. But by far and large, most 98% of the time, you're going to be fine. In fact, we do that for tendinopathies. I have people do that to help with tendinopathies. So if we do something quick, that's where things can get a little dicey. It's like, okay, I want you to jump, and when you land, your knee caves in. I want to maybe avoid that. But you can't jump slowly. You can squat slowly. So when I start thinking of like poor patterns, quote unquote, I start thinking, well, how do we do this with good tempo? Because I may not be able to make your movement look great, but if I can give you tempo and load it, I can at least make the tissues stronger in that load vector, because tissues will tend to adapt to the load vectors that are applied to it. So I might be able to still build some resiliency. So when I've worked with people that have had like CP, for example, their knees will cave in, or like one knee will cave in and the other knee is fine. I'll just give tempo, and I'll like just focus on trying to do this. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just take 5 seconds to lower it, and let's load it up. Let's get you as strong as we can in the positions you can occupy, because that'll build more resiliency than just, saying, hey, you know what, we're not going to load it too much because it's not a great movement pattern or whatever. But tempo is a great way to limit that. And then reactive neuromuscular training is probably one of my favorite ways to train those folks. I think, Georgia, you're about to say something.
No, I just, I going back to Carl's point, like everything you're describing here, these are already tools that a CCP coach has, right? Like someone who's been through that education, they know this stuff. They already have these principles and understanding in their head. And Carl, you mentioned maybe a lack of confidence in working with certain clients, even if like technically you know some of the things you need to know. One thing that feels really important is just not being afraid to ask questions. Like actually talk to that client, ask them what they're experiencing with their condition, how it limits them or doesn't limit them. Get into their history, ask them to explain their medical history to you. Don't kind of tiptoe around that stuff and feel awkward about it, because if you do, that's when you're going to run into issues. So just making sure that coaches are upfront, and also in saying, I haven't worked with a client who has experienced this before, so I need you to help be an advisor in educating me on your experience so I can do the best possible job I can for you. So yeah, just getting over that like fear of talking about the thing, whatever the thing is, and being open to that dialogue as such an important part of coaching adaptive clients, or clients, cancer survivors, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I can kind of picture some coaches' faces as you walk through simple to you patterns over parts and your explanation behind that, right? We were having a conversation, I think it was it on this podcast last week, when we were talking about the story of like the artist that just like painted this little picture quickly in like 5 minutes and then sold it for $20,000, right?
Yep.
And the person was like, how the hell are you going to charge me $20,000 for this picture that you just painted in 5 minutes? Exactly, right? So Bann's explanation, he made it beautifully simple, but that's 15 years of experience to make it that simple. So as a coach, when you hear that and you're like, oh my God, that's so simple to him, but it just went over my head after he said patterns over parts, that's okay, right? You just have to go in, do the thing, ask the questions, expose yourself to that situation, do it a lot of times, and then eventually you'll be able to say that patterns over parts. You'll be able to recite that the same way that Bann did. So I just want to say that, right? Like sometimes some things are very simple, right? In our own heads, and you know this, simple in our own heads, but the person listening is like deer in the headlights, and they're like, how the fuck did you get there? And we're just like, it's simple. It's just principles, right? Like, this shit, right? And they're like, well, it's like downloaded in my brain, but I know it, but I don't understand it yet. You know what I mean? So that's where experience just is really, really important, and being okay with where you're at, and whatever those tools are that are in that toolbox, just take those tools and work with that person and continue to get really, really good at whatever that thing is. In this case, that adaptive athlete, right?
Yeah. I think clients, if we draw on pain science, so we draw on pain science, and I draw on pain science a lot for my practice as a coach, just not because I work with only people that have pain, but there are brilliant principles in that. If you stub your toe and you can no longer play with your kids, and that's like the number one thing in your life is playing with your kids, that is the worst stub toe in the world. But if you stub your toe and it's like whatever, because you can still live your life how you want to live, it hurts, but it's different. So your emotional attachment to whatever you're going through, the ability to choose your own destiny, have a say in your own destiny is massively important. And so when we think about, working with anyone, adaptive athlete or not, letting them have a say, giving them a choice and giving them part of the decision-making process, that automatically can smooth a lot of stuff over, because you may be working with somebody and you may be thinking, well, I got to get them better at this squat. And if we don't even ask them, do you even care about squatting? Like, do you really care? Or do you just want to do you want to be able to just not need that walker and be happy and comfortable and not living in pain all the time? And you'd be amazed at how sometimes if you just say, do you even give a shit? And literally word it like that if you want. Just be real and authentic in however you approach it. And you might find that some people are just like, you know what? Actually, I don't really care about doing, back squats with the bar to a box. I kind of like goblet squats more. I'm more comfortable with that. And then boom, that changes the program. And ask clients know how they feel. I always like to try and think that my clients know how they feel better than I do. So I ask them all the time, hey, man, how'd that feel? And ask 2 days later as well. Because sometimes, when you work with somebody that really wants to get better at something and they're frustrated because I just can't do this, ask them 2 days later, hey, how'd that feel? Because then the emotions are kind of out. And that's something that I like to do a lot, is I like to ask my clients 48 hours, even a week later, how did that one workout feel? Can you recall what it felt like? What was your experience with it? Because now you're just more logic based. You're not emotionally attached to it as much. You kind of moved on a little bit. And that lets you go, okay, yeah, so that's definitely something we should maybe get rid of. And so, or maybe we should add more in. And so I think, letting the clients have a say in their program. We get caught up a lot in thinking we're the coach, we're gonna write the program. I know where I need to start you. But I think individual design comes down to blending in what the client wants, what they need, and as long as it's nudging them towards their goals, while trying to do no harm. Because if somebody comes to me and they want to do something that's going to kill them, I'll probably turn that away. And you have to have have boundaries as a coach too, and be vulnerable, be willing to tell people hey, I've never worked with anyone like you, so I'm going to let you kind of dictate the race pace here. And I want you to let me know how things are feeling, because I want to make sure that we're hitting the nail on the head and I'm not afraid to course correct. And when you're vulnerable and you're honest with that, I think you create a little bit more trust, and that creates a good bond between the coach and client. And Dr. Clue, actually, she's an adaptive athlete that I've worked with in the past. She has cerebral palsy, and she's a PhD, and she has a brilliant mind. And she said a while back, she said, honor the ask. And to me, that means if somebody comes to you as a coach, and let's say they're an adaptive athlete, or they're just somebody that has some sort of a deficit, and they're not trying to be an athlete, they just want to be able to get more fit or whatever. Honor the fact that they are coming to you saying, hey, I clearly don't know how to get there, because if I did, I wouldn't be here. So can I have some help? Honor that. They're being vulnerable, so be vulnerable back. And it doesn't mean you have to be oh, I'm a crappy coach. I just started yesterday. I don't know what to do here. That's not what it means. It just means, hey, I've never worked with anyone like you. Let's figure this out. Let's work together. And when you do that, it's just, not to be all weird and cheesy, but teamwork makes the dream work. And you'll be surprised that when you do that, you build some serious resiliency. One of my guys, Steve, he's what we would call a more master's athlete, 50s, 60s, massive scoliosis. If you could see me on camera, he's shifted this far. You guys can see me and no one else can see me, but this is his spine. And it's just when you first look at that, you're can I deadlift you? Well, it turns out I can. And he just deadlifted 415 for 3 as what some people would call an older person. And I don't think he's old at all. I mean, if you can deadlift 415 for 3, I don't care who you are. You're youthful. But the entire time I've worked with him, it's been very much how's that feeling, man? What are you feeling? Blah, blah, blah. I want to know how he feels with things. And if it aligns with what I'm expecting, stay the course. But if you ever get feedback and you're I didn't think that's how you would respond, talk about it. I gave him heavy lunges and he's my glutes are on fire. Yep, that sounds about right. Awesome, fantastic. But if he's dude, my knee is on fire. Uh-oh. Okay, I need to talk to you a little bit. So ask for that feedback. Get on CoachRx, get all the subjective feedback and track that. And ask people, hey, did you like that? Was that fun? Are you entertained? Because fitness has to be entertaining. not going to do it if it's miserably boring. So ask your clients, hey, this is kind of a weird movement, but you digging it? Are you cool with it? Is it a good challenge? You want to change it up? Have those consults. Talk to people, like let them know, hey, I want you to have a decision in this process.
Yeah, sorry, I'm taking this conversation a little bit different just because you brought that guy up in it. It reminded me of this video I just watched. Have you guys heard of this guy, Andrew Hiller?
No.
He's like, he's a YouTuber, but he's like on this mission to just like call out CrossFitters he's a CrossFitter himself, I believe, or ex-CrossFitter, but he's on this mission to like destroy CrossFitters that are submitting videos with not up to standard with like workouts, right? Like with like the open and semifinals or quarterfinals and semifinals. And when you mentioned the Masters guy, and I like I heard about this guy like yesterday, so I watched a video last night, and he called out the David Hippensteel. You know what I'm talking about? The guy that won he was like I think he's like 60 or something like that, and he's won like 3 CrossFit games in a row. And he like showed the video of this guy, and this guy's like, he's doing an overhead squat. And you guys can't see me because we're on audio, but he's doing an overhead squat like this. So the barbell is probably an inch off of his head, and it like actually lands on his head on a few reps.
Carl's elbows are at 90-degree angles right now.
A little lower.
Yeah, maybe like
Carl's flexing his biceps. He's flexing on
But he's there, and he's like rolling through this. Judge is like, yeah, good. And then he does this. He posts this other video. There's like a pistol. It was a quarterfinals workout with pistols, and he's like doing these pistols, and he's like going quarter. And this guy like did this video on him, like calling him out, like, hey man, like this is ridiculous. Like there's no way you can submit this. And he got disqualified, or he pulled out, or something like that because of these videos that was posted by this Andrew Hiller guy. But he was like sending him like messages saying like, hey, you don't know what it's like. I'm 60 something years old, and I'm dealing with pain all day, every day, because I've been doing this competitive fitness thing for like the last 10 years, and it's not easy. And I have all of these issues, and I can't put my arms over my head anymore, and I can't do this, and I can't do that. And you mentioning your Masters guy, and I'm not comparing adaptive athletes to Masters athletes, but there's some similarities and things that those athletes have to deal with. And the reason I say that is because just like this David guy was saying to this other YouTube dude, like, you don't understand what it's like. I'm working to these standards, right? Like I have to hit these standards by any means necessary. And you get some Masters athletes that are like, I want to compete in this thing. And no matter what their movement screen looks like, no matter how they feel when they do that thing, they have it in their brains that I have to do an overhead squat. I have to do a snatch. I have to bring my body through the rings and a muscle up and drive myself over and extend my elbows, right? I have to do all these things. And it's like you take them through an assessment and you're like, fuck no, right? And this guy, and I bring this guy up because he's like the best, right? Like he won the CrossFit Games 3 years in a row. You take that guy through a movement screen. What do you think? Because I know you've worked with a bunch of Masters athletes. Mm-hmm. You take those athletes through a movement screen, or you just see their capabilities in movement, understanding what the standard is and what kind of things they have to do. How do you approach that? Like, are you just like, any means necessary? We're going to do some R&T shit prior to that, and we're going to open you up. We're going to do some hangs. We're going to fucking damage control just so you hit the standard, whatever the standard is. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, to be very fair, like athletes will die for points. And if you are an athlete, you have to be willing to send it. And if the standard is the standard, right? If you're going to play a sport and the standard is this, and that's what the sports regulating body says you have to do to be qualified to compete, then I honestly don't care. Like, we're going to do that. And if it's a higher injury risk, like I said, we're minimizing injury risk as best as we can based on the goals, needs, and wants of the client. So if that client comes to me and I got to do this, man, it's like, all right, cool. You understand that your movement isn't the nicest and like there's a higher potential for injury. Yep. Awesome. Let's go. Right.
So where is the line? And I know you don't have the answer to this. It's just like, hey, thought experiments. I'll think about it. Where is the line? So we have this thing in our heads, right? We're like, do no harm, right? Unless, right? Like, unless the athlete wants to do harm to themselves, then I'm okay in being complicit to that.
Yeah.
Like, where do you draw that line? Or maybe, I don't know, Georgia, in the room, Georgia, where do you draw that line of like, I'm going to work with this client while knowing I'm going to do them harm because they want the harm because they'll die for points, right? So I think it's a conundrum that a lot of coaches that have a lot of experience and like really care about the people that they work with, I think it's a conundrum that they might experience when they're like, I don't want to do any harm to this person. I know they probably shouldn't be doing this, but who am I to say that they shouldn't be doing it, right? Like what is that? How do we draw that line?
I draw the line by saying what I specifically write in the Coach RX.
Mm-hmm.
I don't design the competition workout that they do. That's not on me. That's on the regulating body. But what I will write into Coach RX is everything I can to minimize the risk for them when that day comes. So there's a big difference between training for elite level sport, high level sport, versus just training to have sex until you're 90 years old. So when you're training for CrossFit, like I draw that line of like, hey man, so you definitely aren't the best at overhead squats. We're probably not going to do heavy overhead squats 4 times a week. But during the pre-competition phase, you're going to have to touch on it. I have to give you some exposure because you have to be ready for it. You have to do some muscle ups, but we're going to spend a giant chunk of the off season working on this. And we have to be aware that because you're a master's athlete, there's probably been some tissue changes, right? Bone can remodel, and you might actually have some extra growth that's going to limit your ability to go overhead. Maybe your chromium is flat versus curved or whatever, and so your overhead mobility is just going to be different because of your structure. Whatever it is, you have injuries, scar tissue, whatever, you're going to have to work around that. And then when game day comes, hopefully we did enough good quality, quote unquote quality volume in the off season, and we did enough things to load you with good tempo, smart movement, etc., that you're resilient enough to survive that 3 to 5 day window of competing. And then we just manage all the other stuff, hormones, blood glucose, immune system regulation, nervous system, all these different things that I do. Like with my clients as well, I manage a lot of that because I think that's something that people forget. When you start to lose some of the physiology, pain is more likely to happen, injury is more likely to happen because you're having less recovery. And if I can optimize those things, a lot of the times it gets better, and you'll see people improve their movement without doing corrective exercise just by getting their metabolism better, right? Hormones are better. Fixing their nutrition, getting them less inflamed. A lot of stuff can kind of clean up on its own if you take care of those things. And I think we kind of forget about that because we're so caught up in movement. But
Would you say that's damage control? Like your design is, I don't want to say your design, the coach's design is damage control, getting them ready for what they're going to experience.
I think every program is damage control, right? If I'm training you just to have sex until you're 90, you're going to have to pick up groceries at some point. Like we'll use my mom as an example. So she just got out of the hospital a few weeks ago. She really
That was an interesting transition, by the way.
No, well, I think it's a perfect example because
No. Sorry, I was trying to be funny there. You said having sex to your 90, and then you said, I'll take my mom for example. I'm like, where is he going with this?
Yeah, my bad. Definitely wasn't thinking that. So about a month ago, she hurt herself so bad. No idea how. No timelines aligned with injury and pain mechanisms. But she called 911 and she kind of crawled to the door because she couldn't walk. And she had to unlock the door, and paramedics came in, put her on the stretcher, got her to the emergency room. And long story short, she was in so much pain. She was in the hospital for a couple of weeks, and I was kind of with her very often, trying to spend as much time as I could with her. She's just crying and screaming, saying it's worse than natural childbirth. And she did that twice. So anytime a woman says that to me, I'm like, oh, that sounds horrible. Turned out she had a full-on L1, L2 disc sequestration. So the nucleus pulsal exploded out of the annulus and just jammed on the nerve. She lost all motor control of her left side, lower left leg, hip, knee, and ankle. Couldn't walk, couldn't move, couldn't go to the bathroom, couldn't do anything. So she gets sent to assisted living. She's in assisted living for a few weeks. Finally is comfortable enough to go home on her own, but now has to have in-home health aides, in-home physical therapy, etc. She just got out of bed funky, right? It's like somebody picks up a toaster and their back blows out somehow. So she got out of bed, maybe twisted the wrong way, and then like that was just the straw that broke the camel's back. However, she finally started doing CrossFit last July, and she could deadlift, 100 pounds for a couple sets of 5. And I, honest to goodness, think that if she hadn't been doing CrossFit, that type of thing probably would have killed her. Like that level of pain and that level of injury, because it wasn't from CrossFit. CrossFit actually improved her movement and did all these things. But life is going to get you sick. You're going to get hurt in life. You're going to deal with disease. You're going to deal with something that like knocks you out for a bit. Program design should be there to help you become more resilient. So when it happens, mentally, emotionally, you're stronger. Physically, you're able to withstand it more. I mean, I hurt my back every now and then. Like my elbows are hurt. Like I won't tap on something quick enough, and next thing you know, like it takes a week for my elbow to feel better. But because I can do pull-ups and because I can deadlift and I can squat, I'm able to be like, all right, mentally I'm a little bit tougher. I'm able to handle that more. I can survive more. As Mark Rippetoe says, strong people are harder to kill and more useful in general. So when we talk about program design and damage control, a good program should be damage control for any goal. Because I can't, who's to say like today I don't get into a car accident at some point, but being stronger gives me a higher chance of survivability. I've fallen off my motorcycle like 6 times. I've like laid out my bike 6 times. It's dirt biking and whatnot. So like I'm not out there on the highway doing 120, but because I'm strong, there's a risk when you take a motorcycle off road, right? And because I'm strong and I hit the ground 25 miles an hour really hard, I got up and I was like, oh man, I'm good. Like, oh, my neck's a little tweaked, but nothing's broken because my bones are more dense. My tendons are stronger. So all program design should be damage control because you're going to get hurt at some point in your life. And that's something that I think coaches need to wrap their head around. And I get really passionate and emotional about it because life is full of shit. It hurts. Life can hurt. You're going to have pain. All the research in the world shows us that at some point, pretty much everyone's going to have back pain. Right? You can't stop it. You can't stop yourself from having a rolled ankle. You step off a curb wrong, and if you've never worked out a day in your life, you might tear one of your ligaments. If you've done a lot of split squats, you step off the curb, yeah, you rolled your ankle, but guess what? You're fine in 10 days. So program design is damage control at all times.
Until the program is the thing that's damaging you.
Yeah.
Well, all exercise is damaging, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that the goal? I want to make you weaker. I want to damage you and make you stronger, but I want to do it with the right
Yeah.
dose.
Yeah.
Right? So if I dose it for a high-level athlete, yeah, absolutely. I liken it to baseball, right? You want to throw 96 miles an hour? Yeah, that's probably not the best thing for your shoulder, but if you, as the athlete, deem that the reward is worth the risk, let's go. I will 100% take a slap tear for $10 million a year. Yeah, you can cut my shoulder in half right now if you want to give me $10 million a year for 5 years. I can always get surgery and fix it later. This is the same thing for CrossFit. I think it's just people judge it because CrossFit doesn't pay you $10 million a year.
The role of the fitness coach in CrossFit versus other sports is different though. There's definitely, you run into a different conversation if you're talking about, okay, I have a CrossFit athlete. They have persistent wrist pain when they clean, but I got to clean them in training because they're going to clean in competition. They still have to do those movements. If I'm working with a BJJ athlete and they are experiencing elbow pain because they popped their elbow, am I going to then go do in the weight room what's going to potentially make that elbow pain worse?
Sometimes.
No.
Yes, absolutely. When you talk about tendinopathies, you absolutely should work through that.
If they just got their elbow massively overextended?
Not like today. If
an acute injury.
Yeah, an acute injury. No, just calm shit. Greg Lehman says it really well. Calm shit down, build shit back up. Right? So your elbow pops because you didn't tap. You tried to hitchhiker and you couldn't get out and boom, next thing you know, pop. Yeah, give it a little bit of time.
Yeah.
But it's going to hurt. And at some point, we're going to have to probably put a 100-pound dumbbell in your hand and make you walk and do a suitcase carry.
For sure.
And so there's a point where you do actually have to train through pain and you have to be okay with it. And that's why we have coaches to tell us, go sit down and rest. That's why somebody hires you, Georgia, and then they tell you, and you're like, yeah, you know what? Give it a couple weeks. Let's work on it in a few weeks.
Yeah. For the most part, though, I think in the weight room, in the strength and conditioning world, in other sports where the sport is not the training, you're doing everything you can to make sure that what you're doing in that training isn't going to prevent them from doing what they actually need to do in the sport.
100%.
So it's just a different a different weighing up of is it worth it or is it not with other athletes versus CrossFitters or Olympic weightlifters or powerlifters where their training is their sport.
Well, I think I think yes and no. When I think about working with somebody let's take an adaptive athlete going, into CrossFit, right? So I know that thrusters are going to wreck them. And I know that there's a higher injury risk potentially with thrusters with this person's specific movement. That doesn't mean like if their competition, let's say they're doing a local adaptive athlete competition in March, I'll probably give them thrusters in February, but I'm probably not doing it in April if they have 12 months to prepare. I'm probably going to be working on all of the things to help make that movement less damaging in the off season. And then in the pre-competition season, I'm going to start working on some things and I'm going to communicate, hey, now remember, thrusters wreck you. You always get a little tired here. So remember to take an extra breath per rep. Slow it down a little bit. Let this be your active recovery in the actual workout and send it on the assault bike or whatever it is. So ultimately, like when I think of like jujitsu, we'll come back to that point. I'm training you to be resilient for the sport, right? And the sport is on the mat. Whereas CrossFit, the sport is on the floor, right? But I'm still training you to be resilient for it. And then like pre-competition is kind of like in jiu-jitsu, like I'm probably not going to give you workouts for a week prior to your tournament. Like I don't want you to walk in there sore and wrecked and tired. But I think ultimately we're still just trying to give people something that makes them resilient. And then the pre-competition is up to us to program and say, yep, this is what it's going to feel like. This is what it's going to look like. It's going to suck. Get over it. But I mean, you have to detach from that. Jiu-jitsu is not healthy for you. Like anyone that says it's the gentle art, no, it's not gentle at all. So I think we have to get beyond the idea that like training for sport and training for health are two different things. But I do think we also have to stop saying they're entirely separate, because you can still train for really good strength levels and train for health. Like I have a 200 kilogram back squat and I'm a pretty healthy dude. I just ran my labs. Like the only thing I got to worry about are my kidneys. And that's just something I've always dealt with. But everything else is great. Hormones are great. Nervous system is great. Liver's great. Gut's great. Everything's great. And I have a 200 kilogram squat. And so sometimes we get a little bit too far and we say like, oh, high level performance is also unhealthy. And I think there's got to be somewhere in the middle, and it's very N=1. I'm not saying that it's going to be like you can approach that macroscopically, but
yeah, I think in the sports that are literally done in the weight room, I think that's where there's a lot of weirdness, right? Because it's like, yeah, like it's good when people are stronger, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like that's where not the confusion is, but I think that's where people get stuck, where it's like, when if you talk to someone and you're like, hey, first three sports that come to mind, go, and they're like CrossFit, weightlifting, powerlifting. It's like, okay, cool. Right. Yeah, I can kind of see how there's carryover because you're doing the same types of things, right? Or there's some carryover. If you talk to a different person, you're like 3 sports, go, and they're like football, soccer, baseball. You're like, okay, now it's really easy to have the conversation of like the way that you train for football, soccer, baseball is going to look completely different than how you train just to live and be healthy and to be vital, right? Maybe let me take baseball out because that's a weird one. Let me put like hockey in there, right? Because that's more of I love baseball, but it's more of a physically demanding sport. No offense, baseball players. I played baseball for a long time. So that's where I think the confusion is, right? It's like performance and sport are such general terms, right? And like kind of in the world that a lot of people live in that are connected to us, when they think of performance and sport, they do think of those 3 things. They think of weightlifting, CrossFit, powerlifting. And that's where like this really niche, small, one-off conversation happens where it's like performance and health are just different, right? They are different. If we were to say weightlifting, it's like, would you argue that snatching and cleaning is healthy for you?
To what level? I think
let me rephrase that because that's such a general term. Would you argue that snatching and cleaning on their own, right, will lead to you living longer and having better sex when you're 90?
I think it can, absolutely. When I think of health, though, I like to define health as living well despite the inescapable diseases we're all going to encounter. And I steal that from one of my mentors, Dr. Tom. That's something that I think we get caught up in, is like, how are we defining health? Well, ultimately, can you live the way you want to live based on your values and knowing still going to get sick at some point. You're still going to roll your ankle. You're still going to stub your toe, all these things. Can you still do the things you want to do and live the life you want to live? And I think in that definition, absolutely. I think you can still do snatches. You can still do cleans. Now, if you have poor movement, or if you have, like a collarbone separation, right, like an AC joint issue, and you try to, clean 405 pounds, you might be stretching it there to call it healthy, right? But I think for some people, it's absolutely possible. I mean, we'll use me as an example. I just got my labs back, and I'm in really good health, with the exception of like a kidney thing that I got going on, which I've had for years, and I'm constantly working on it. I have a 200 kilogram back squat. I train 4 hours on the mat 3 times a week, and I'm in the gym 4 to 5 times a week. Now, I also don't have a wife. I don't have roommates. I live alone. Like, I don't have these extra stressors. I don't have kids. I don't have a family.
Wives aren't stresses.
What's that?
Wives aren't stresses.
No.
I'm kidding.
Oh, okay. I was like, that's definitely not, that's not what I meant. I just don't have other responsibilities.
Unless you're Johnny
right?
Depp.
Yeah. Oh, man. But I don't have responsibilities like other than just like being on Coach RX and then training. So I can do that.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we get so caught up in dealing, and coming back to adaptive athletes, we get caught up in thinking about health and mechanics and physiology. But guys, we got to remember that the nervous system is king. Now, yeah, the gut is queen. So, gut health is the queen of everything, and happy wife, happy life. But ultimately, if you can just manage the nervous system, you're going to find, even if you give what we might call crappy movement, right, for sport, like your ring muscle ups, even though your scratch test is terrible, or snatches, even though you can't go overhead with something. If we just monitor the nervous system, you will be amazed at how much less injuries will occur. You'll be amazed at how hormones will tend to be a little bit better. Now, we have to be aware that as you get older, your T levels will probably drop. There's bioaccumulation of toxicity. We've destroyed our soil. We've jacked up our pollution in our environment. So life is inflammatory in and of itself. But if we just monitor some basic things, we can push people pretty hard and then recognize like it's all high-low methodology. And this is what I think CCP coaches, they know, but they don't realize they know it. It's like, you already know this stuff. Like, you're not thinking about it in this light. And so it's like being a white belt, a sweep, and then being a purple belt, the same sweep, but the purple belt sees the sweep in a very different way and can apply it in different ways. The brand new CCP coach has all the tools, but knowing how to apply them, they just have to get out into the trenches and realize it. It takes time. But if you think about like an adaptive athlete, if I give you those thrusters and we know that those thrusters are hard on you, well, that's a high intensity day then. So what do we do when we have high intensity days? We give low intensity days. We give zone 1, or maybe map 10, I think is what we call it now. We make you go for a walk. We make you just rest and chill. So I might give somebody, like one of my athletes, I would give them like running, right? And he had a really, really, really bad limp. He couldn't control his left leg. So when you talk about like moving, like, it was rough. That was his intense day. Doing 400-meter jogging intervals, that was intense. But he can go walk or he can go swim, and I'd have him do those things for his accumulation day. Intensity, accumulation, or volume, right? And so if we just give high-low methodology, you get away with a lot of stuff. So if I know, like James, come back to his point, yep, thrusters are terrible for you. Guess what? We're going to do that once every 2 weeks. The rest of the time, we're going to be doing things that kind of build on that, but we're not going to give you the full movement. So that way we only touch intensity and drive your nervous system, really redline it only once in a while. And that's where something as simple as just using an Apple Watch. I've used Whoop, I've used Morpheus, I've done Oura Ring stuff. Apple Watch works just as well. Garmin watches just work just as well. Just what is your HRV like when you wake up, right? And you look at that and you're like, oh man, my HRV is this. And then every time I do thrusters the next day, it's like, whoa, it's terrible. Maybe we look at that and we say, okay, you know what? Every time we do that movement, we need to give you a day off the next day. And I did that with Whoop. I would do that with myself and, 100 people. And we would just look at like digestion. Chew your food. The next day, recovery score, really great. Don't chew your food. The next day, recovery score, not so great. So maybe it's not the workouts. Maybe it's like that variable. So don't forget like BLGs. If you do BLGs properly, it prevents a lot of problems, which is why we're so big on them. Chew your food. Adequately hydrate. Don't drink water while you're eating food. That helps a ton. Those things right there, that'll take care of adaptive athletes. That'll make them better. That'll help them a ton. Get them to sleep. Get sleep buy-in, cold rooms, dark, 2-3 hours before midnight. You do those things, you can probably give some harder stuff and like watch people bounce back. Humans are resilient, man. I mean, dudes deploy and sleep 3 hours a night for 4 months, 5 missions a night, just completely crushed. They come home, give them 3 weeks, they're back to normal. Humans are so resilient. And we get caught up in forgetting that we come from a line of people that would hunt bears with sticks, and we'd kill them with sticks and we'd eat them. We're cavemen still, but we kind of, get into this mindset of like fragility. And as coaches, don't be afraid to like push your clients. Don't be afraid to like, hey, how do you feel about this? How did that feel? Because I'm going to push you, and have standards for clients. That was one of the things that I found was like, I'm not going to baby an adaptive athlete. I don't care that you have cerebral palsy. I mean, I care. Don't get me wrong. Like, I care about you and I care that you have it, but I'm going to hold you to a standard, and I'm going to demand that you meet this standard because I believe that you're a resilient human being. Yeah, sure, you need to walk with a limp, and it's kind of hard for you to pick up a barbell, so we use a strap on the left hand and normal grip on the right hand. Awesome. Load it up. I don't care. I'm going to load it up, and I'm going to give you tempo. I'm going to make sure you get stronger. And you'd be amazed at how when somebody starts realizing, oh, shit, I'm actually pretty strong. Like, I'm not actually weak. All of a sudden, pain goes away. Injuries go away. Because remember, pain and damage, they can be separate. You can have pain without any damage, and it can be 100% emotional. I got a great client. His name is Dan. Guy is awesome. And when I first started working with him, his mindset was a little bit more in the lens of fragility. And now he's realizing, like, I'm fucking tough, and I can actually take a beating. And he's been able to hit PRs on things. He's been able to get stronger. He just tweaked something the other day. He did a workout at 6:30 in the morning, which is normally not his normal time. He tweaked an adductor. His mindset's like, hey, man, I tweaked my adductor. Going to need a day or two off, but it'll be fine in a week. Versus like catastrophizing things, right? And if you just let people realize that they're so much stronger than they really are, don't hold people back. Talk to them, ask them how it felt. But man, we're freaking cavemen still. Let them be cavemen.
I think that's a great place to wrap up.
Let them be cavemen, man. Let them be cavemen.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, man. That was good.
Yeah, Michael, it was great to have you. And for those listening, we will make sure we drop in links to learn more about both remote coaching mentorship and then actual coaching with you. So those will be in the description. People can follow you at coach_Michael_Bann on
I got to
Instagram.
come up with another name. That's too many like syllables.
It's long.
Yeah, it is. But yeah, it's at coach_Michael_Bann, and then I have a TikTok, which I think is Bandwagon.
On the old TikTok, huh?
Yeah, I'm just trying to help, create some cool videos out there using voiceovers. Yeah.
Love it. Well, guys, thanks for listening. Be sure to leave us a review, like, and subscribe. We do appreciate it. See you next week.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.